Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. This week we're going to show you a portrait of Dame Mary Beard. You can see the time lapse up on screen at the moment. This was actually painted as part of Sky Art's Portrait Artist of the Week. So we're up to week 9. This is a bonus week they did. Because the show proved so popular with artists around the world, thousands of people taking part, they decided to get an extra sitter in, and I took screenshots as usual and decided to work on this last one on screen now. So one of the advantages of the screenshots is that you can capture these fleeting expressions and positions. So this painting probably took me around about 2.5 hours to complete. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the video is I'm showing you a slightly speeded up version. I guess I've speeded it up by about a factor of 7 or something like that. And as we go through, obviously I'll tell you what I'm doing, but also I'll try and give you some of the tips that I've kind of either relearned or reminded myself of throughout the course of doing these 9 weeks of portraits with the Portrait Artist of the Week show. So first up, I'm using a watercolor marker pen for my preliminary sketch. Now, for some of the sitters, I just went straight in and did the portrait. For other sitters, I did preliminary sketches. So, for example, last week with Professor Green, I did loads of quick sketches and then did a final painting. And both of those techniques have advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, when you do the early sketches, then you kind of learn about the sitter's face. But I decided this week to just go straight in with the main painting, because I feel sometimes you lose a little bit of spontaneity if you over prepare. Yeah. So for that reason, I decided to just go straight in and say, right, okay, I'm not going to do any warm-up sketches. I'm just going to do the finished thing. Here we go. And the watercolor marker is really good because I love drawing with it. It's so smooth to draw with. You can move the paint around with a brush afterwards, and my hope is that I'm going to leave some of this early stage drawing showing through in the final painting. I'm using a turquoise marker here, and I tend to use this because I think it works well with flesh tones in general. And also it's a reasonably neutral colour, but it can kind of work well in some of the shadows as well. It's not too dark so that, if I want to cover it up, I'm going to have a problem. I can cover it quite easily with acrylic if I need to. So what I did is, while I was chatting away there, is I worked fairly quickly and established a face on the mixed media paper that I'm using. And now I'm going back round and just refining my drawing quite carefully. So my next tip would be that while it's nice to have a free-flowing, gestural, kind of loose, expressive drawing, and that's something that, I always enjoy creating, while you may end up with a convincing human face, it's not necessarily going to be a great likeness because the proportions for portrait work have to be so precise. So that's why I'm going back round and correcting my line work as best I can. Now, having done that, I'm now taking a flat synthetic brush, which I've just dipped in clean water. And you can see I'm running that across the line work that I've done and using the bit of pigment that I pick up on the brush to create areas of tone. And that's going to start to produce some three-dimensional modelling for me. And it's a really quick way to work. It's really great, this technique, by the way, if you're working outdoors. If you're sketching a seascape or a landscape or just people in a cafe or something. It's really quick and expressive. So now what I'm doing here is just looking again at my drawing, and I'm not convinced by what I've done with the nose. And having taken those measurements, I realised that although, as I just said, the drawing I've done is a convincing human face, I've got the nose about 20% too long. So that's my next tip. If you spot a mistake like that, don't leave it and try and kind of gradually correct it. Just be brutal, which is what I'm doing now. I'm coming in now with a magenta watercolor marker and correcting what I've done. So in a way, it's kind of heartbreaking to do that a little bit because I was really quite happy with the turquoise drawing that I created there. But you can see that I've actually now moved up the base of the nose and the position of the mouth and chin. And hopefully you'll see by the end that creates, you know, a convincing likeness of Mary Beard. And the reason I used magenta there is because it's in stark contrast to the turquoise, so it's really easy to see where my corrected line is. But now what I'm doing is just with a little bit of burnt umber, interactive acrylic, mixed with various proportions of titanium white. Just added some tone to, again, quickly create a sense of 3 dimensions. And now I'm coming in with a flesh tone. So regardless of the ethnic background of the person you're painting, you can, generally speaking, mix up any flesh tone from, you know, the 3 primaries. So the primaries I'm using are alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and cadmium yellow. And you want to experiment with those 3 in the proportions. And I would recommend going for a mid-tone first, which is what I did there. I blocked in the face and neck with the mid-tone. Now I'm adding a slightly lighter tone. And so my next tip is, if you're adding highlights to flesh, do it gradually. So add just a little bit of white and go around the face and neck and gradually lighten areas where you feel it's needed. Then add a little bit more titanium white and go around again where you think the next stage of bright areas is, and so on and so on. And in general, that's a nice way to kind of just gradually inch towards the subtle variations in tone and light and dark that you get across a person's face. So now I'm putting in some rather bolder highlights, and notice I'm using the same flat brush for pretty much all of the work on the face here. And the reason is, flat brushes are very adaptable, so they can kind of act as sort of 3 or 4 brushes in one, because you can angle the brush to put down the corner of the brush to give you a little dot. You can use the edge of the bristles to give you a very fine line. Obviously you can put down a square shaped brush stroke or a rectangle very easily, and by angling the brush in different ways you can get a variety of shapes. So I do switch to another brush later, but for the most part this is the brush I use for the main bulk of the painting. So I'm adding some blue highlights there on the left hand side of the neck and on other areas of the neck and face as well. So that's my next tip. Look for the colours in the shadows and look for the reflected light onto a person's face as well. So the skin of a person is never just one colour. It's always a wide range of colours. And you've got to pick out that multitude of colours. And if you're just starting out, that can perhaps seem a little bit, a little bit scary. It doesn't, perhaps feel quite right. But you'll get a better effect overall by observing those multitude of colours and just putting them on and being quite bold about it than you will if you just try and say, if you're painting a van or something, you might just put in blue across the whole thing. And then you could perhaps add a few highlights and a few shadows. And although it would be a simplistic treatment, you might still have a convincing van or a convincing car. But for a person, the shapes and the contours and the way the light's bouncing around, it's much more complex. So you've got to pick out those range of colours. So while I've been chatting away there, I've just speeded things up a little bit more because I'm doing more detailed work now. So I'm gradually working around the face and adding more and more detail. So the next tip is start with large marks and big bold marks, big patches of colour and tone, and then gradually, very gradually, go smaller and smaller and smaller. So you do the detail stuff at the end, and you don't necessarily need to add detail everywhere in the painting, because by adding detail selectively, perhaps on the eyes, nose and mouth, that's going to be enough to make the painting convincing. And then the other areas are in less detail where you don't want there to be so much focus. So the way I treat the eyes is to basically paint the irises as a simple disc of colour that I think is appropriate. For the whites of the eye, I will generally combine a little bit of ultramarine blue with titanium white to give me a slightly off-white. So the whites of the eye are not ever, I would say, pure white. They might be a milky grey in general, and there might be highlights as well within those whites of the eye. But nevertheless, a sort of slightly off-white heading towards the blue is a good place to start. And you can see that as I'm adding more and more detail, there are still some regions that I've left almost untouched, in particular the outline of the head, where those original watercolour marker lines are still there. And I kind of feel the sketchiness of those lines works well for the hair, and I love the contrast between that underworked area and the more finished area of the face, which I'm gradually developing. Now, question, have any of you spotted the glaring mistake that I haven't spotted as I'm painting at the moment? So the glaring mistake is, look at the left-hand shoulder as we're looking at it, and look how low it is. It just doesn't look right at all. Now, rest assured, I do spot that in a moment, and I do correct it. But again, it's really easy to get so involved in your painting that you don't spot those sort of structural errors. I mean, I suppose that, you know, there could conceivably be an angle that she could be holding herself. You know, she was twisting quite dramatically, so that left-hand shoulder could almost be that low. But nevertheless, I do end up correcting it. And the hair as well, you can see there, here you go. So I'm correcting it now. And I'm using the same treatment that I used right back at the start. I just used the watercolour marker and then a damp brush. Felt the need to enlarge the right-hand shoulder as well. You can see the head is now sitting on the body much more convincingly. So that's my next tip, is that even though it's really, you know, enticing and enjoyable to get involved in the little detailed bits in the eyes and the nostrils and the expression in the corners of the mouth and so on, we have to continually step back and detach from what we're doing and look at our painting and think to ourselves, does this look good as a whole? Does it look structurally correct? You know, is it a convincing human being? And then my next tip is, when you come into the likeness, you've got to look for these subtle variations. So you can see even now I had two convincing eyes, but I modified the eye on our right, and I'm more or less completely repainting it and adjusting very carefully the light in the eye, the shape that the eyelid makes, and all of those things to capture the likeness. And then my final tip at the end, or not final tip, but one of my final tips is, towards the end of the painting, feel free to be bold and add some striking little dashes of colour or tone here and there if you want to, but be sparing with those little finishing touches. So there's the finished painting. I really enjoyed painting this one. I think it's my favourite out of the 9 weeks of portraits. Hope you enjoyed watching along with me, and I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe. Thanks very much for watching.